Hello everyone. So today we're going to have a look at 1920 society. If you haven't already, make sure you watch the first video on 1920s economy, because as always they're linked together, economy and society. If you're going to be doing your mind map today, just a reminder, that's a good idea before you start watching. Mind map everything that you know about these three topics. So prohibition, women and entertainment. And then once you've done that, press play on this video, watch the video through, and then go back and add anything that you've missed out. It's a good idea to do that in a different colour, and then you can sort of see where your gaps were. Okay, so we're going to start off with prohibition. Now, we looked at the causes of prohibition in lesson, in particular these two groups here, the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. We had a look at some key features of prohibition. So, for example, because they ban alcohol, people found ways of making illegal alcohol, and that's nicknamed moonshine or bathtub gin. We also looked at secret bars that were growing called speakeasies. Speakeasy because it's a secret. Talked about how prohibition was actually really difficult to enforce. First of all, it was unpopular, and lots of people actually wanted to keep going to saloons and bars. We also looked at that dynamic between federal, so that big central government, and state government, and local areas sometimes ignoring the federal Supreme Court ruling that banned alcohol. We looked at 1,500 prohibition agents. Now, 1,500 might seem a lot, but when you think about the size of America, that's not a lot at all. And they were poorly paid. So often they were open to bribery by gangsters and people like that. The size of America meant it was difficult to enforce it, but it also meant that because there's so many borders and it's so large, it made it a little bit easier to smuggle in illegal alcohol across the borders, places like Canada, for example. Also difficult to enforce because criminals took advantage of the situation, and we call this organised crime. So, for example, one famous gangster is Al Capone. Now, Al Capone, we think, made around 700 million in today's money from illegal smuggling, bars, trafficking, and lots of illegal activities, but most of it revolved around prohibition. Ultimately, it ended not only because it was unpopular and because it led to lots of crime, but because when Roosevelt became president, he realised that if he could end this, he could tax alcohol and the making of alcohol again, and that would also create some more jobs. So in 1933, Roosevelt ended prohibition. Another social aspect that we're going to look at is women in the 1920s. So, a couple of key facts about women in the 1920s. One is that divorce doubled in the 1920s. This meant that obviously women would be able to have some more freedom, and it showed that there was an appetite perhaps for that. However, remember when women did divorce, sometimes society sort of frowned upon this and did not necessarily include those women. Women did, however, gain the vote, which is massive. That means that politicians now have to listen to them. So, for example, prohibition, Women's Christian Temperance Union, those women perhaps have more of a voice now that they have a vote. There was a 25% increase in women in the workforce in the 1920s. Now, remember though, this is often only single women, and when women were married, they would be expected in most cases to give up those jobs, and often these were lower paid jobs and sort of stereotypical women's jobs. We also talked about flappers and this younger group of women coming through that were more likely to sort of try and subvert gender norms and try and push some boundaries. Now, if you get a question about women in the 20s, remember that not all women experience positive changes. So, for example, some rural women would not have experienced some of those changes. People in the Bible Belt might have resisted and protested against groups such as flappers. And black women, remember, of course, were struggling during the depression, during the 1920s economy, and also were discriminated against. Then the last section we're going to look at is entertainment. As you can see in this picture, we have got a really busy cinema, a large crowd outside it, and we know it's from the 1920s. You can see the advert at the top, Al Johnson's Jazz Singer. Really, really popular in the 1920s and really cheap and accessible. So even those that weren't benefiting from the boom, remember that's 60% of the population, were still able to sometimes go to the cinema. We looked at the start of the 20s, silent movies. So for example, some stars like Charlie Chaplin and also female stars like Clara Bow. But as it progressed, very exciting development was talkies. So they started talking and noise at the cinema, as opposed to just having a band at the front playing in terms of a silent film in front of them. So the first talk is in 1927 and it is The Jazz Singer. And we reckon about 50 million people a week went to the cinema in the 1920s. Another change for entertainment is radio. We touched on this when we looked at the economy in our first video. Remember, the radio we used for advertising economic goods. But also around 50 million again had a radio set in the 20s. So 50 million for the cinema, 50 million for the radio. And they also could advertise things like shows that were at the cinema. It could advertise sports and commentary on sports and helped sports like the New York Yankees and Babe Ruth to become famous. These people would have been played on the radio too. Some really famous jazz stars. So we've got Bessie Smith, really interesting life, and she was orphaned around the age of 9, ended up selling hundreds of thousands of records, known as the Empress of Jazz. Quite a horrible ending in a car crash, and apparently wouldn't be treated in a white hospital and died in an all-black hospital, a segregated hospital. And this is Louis Armstrong, perhaps more famous because he lives a lot longer. That song, I won't sing it on here, but I See Trees Are Green, you might know that one. So two really famous jazz stars as well. So we've got cinema, radio and jazz booming in the 1920s as well. Okay, so some key takeaways then. We looked at prohibition, and remember it's caused by groups like the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. We also talked about aspects like moonshine and speakeasies, gangsters like Al Capone, and Roosevelt ending it in 1933. It's about women, divorce doubling, flappers, 25% more women in work in the 1920s, which gives them that economic freedom, a little bit more independence. Cinema, jazz and radio. Key figure there is 50 million. 50 million going to the cinema, 50 million people having radios, and jazz stars like Bessie Smith and Louis Armstrong. Okay, thank you again for taking time to do some revision. That was only just under 9 minutes. I've got that shorter. Make sure you add to your mind map or you jot down some key takeaways and thoughts just so you've got that down for your revision. Thanks again, guys.